I will never forget the silence that followed. 4,000 delegates from across the known galaxy sat in the grand chamber of the Galactic Council, and not a single one of them made a sound. The human ambassador had just been offered the speaking platform for the third time that week. And for the third time, she had turned it down. "We have nothing to discuss on this matter," said Commander Nora Beckett, and she sat back in her chair as though she had just commented on the weather. "My name is Vathan Driss. I am a Kaloran, a species known throughout the galaxy for patience, diplomacy, and the ability to keep our composure in situations that would reduce most beings to panic. I have served the Galactic Council as a senior diplomat for 312 cycles. I have brokered treaties between species that spent millennia trying to destroy each other. I have negotiated ceasefires across star systems, diffused border conflicts, and once spent 40 straight days in a mediation chamber with the Talani hegemony, without eating or sleeping until both sides agreed to stop firing on each other." They arrived at the Council roughly 14 months before that moment. Their faster-than-light capability was barely a century old, which made them practically infants by galactic standards. Most species take at least 500 years after achieving interstellar travel before they are even considered for Council membership. Humans were offered a provisional seat in under 90. That should have been our first warning. Anything that moves that fast in the galaxy usually has a reason for its speed. Their delegation was small. 7 individuals. Commander Nora Beckett led them. She was a tall woman with sharp features, dark hair pulled back tight, and a pair of pale gray eyes that seemed to record everything they saw. She walked into the grand chamber on that first day with the calm of someone who had already decided something important, though none of us knew what it was. The other 6 members of her team followed in a tight formation, each one carrying a compact device and wearing the same simple gray uniform. They moved like people who had rehearsed this walk many times. The Speaker of the Chamber welcomed her with the traditional greeting. He offered her the seat of welcome, a ceremonial platform at the center of the ring where new species are invited to introduce themselves, share their culture, and express their hopes for galactic cooperation. Every species that had ever joined the Council gave a speech from that platform. Some gave speeches that lasted days. The Rathine Collective once delivered an introduction that ran for 3 weeks, because every member of their hive mind insisted on contributing a sentence. Then she stepped down and took her seat. They would find their voice. Give them a few sessions to observe, and they would be eager to join the conversation. They did not find their voice. The first real test came 12 days later, when the trade accords were put before the chamber. This was standard procedure. Every new member species must negotiate its tariff structure, import restrictions, and resource sharing agreements. It is the foundation of galactic commerce. Without a trade agreement, a species cannot legally exchange goods with any council member. The process usually takes a few sessions, some haggling, some compromise, and then everyone signs. The Trade Committee invited Commander Beckett to the negotiation floor. She stood, looked at the committee chair, and said, Then she sat down. The committee chair, a Rythene named Kosvala, tilted her segmented head in confusion. Commander, without a trade agreement, your species will be unable to participate in galactic commerce. You will be economically isolated from the rest of the galaxy. Understood, said Nora Beckett. Thank you. I remember leaning forward and narrowing my eyes, a Kaleran gesture of confusion that I rarely displayed in public. The delegate beside me, a Pelori physician named Ureth Sol, whispered, "Perhaps they did not understand the process." "Perhaps," I said, but I had seen the way Nora Beckett looked at the committee chair. She understood perfectly. There was nothing confused about those gray eyes. Over the following weeks, it happened again, and again, and again. A border dispute between the Talani and the Virathi erupted over mining rights in the Korath Expanse. Humans had survey ships in the region. They were invited to join the mediation as a neutral party, which was considered an honor for a species so new to the Council. Commander Beckett declined. "We have nothing to discuss on this matter." The Science Council proposed a galaxy-wide data-sharing initiative. Every species would contribute their research archives in exchange for access to the collective pool. It was a landmark opportunity, the kind of agreement that accelerates the progress of civilization by centuries. Dozens of species had waited decades for this proposal. The human delegation was invited to present their scientific contributions. "We have nothing to discuss on this matter." The humans were offered one of the first invitations, a gesture meant to signal how welcome they were. "We have nothing to discuss on this matter." "47. She attended every session without fail. Her delegation sat in their seats, took notes on devices I did not recognize, occasionally whispered to each other in their own language, and never once asked to speak. They were present in body, but absent in every way that mattered. At first, the other delegates treated it as a curiosity, a strange quirk of a young species still finding its footing. Then it became an oddity, then an insult. Conversations in the corridors shifted in tone. What are the humans doing? Why are they here if they refuse to participate? What kind of species joins the most powerful governing body in the galaxy and then sits in silence session after session? I heard theories from every corner. The Rythene believed humans were too primitive to follow council proceedings and were simply pretending to understand while secretly being completely lost. The Auravari, the oldest species in the council, said nothing at all, which was typical of them and deeply unnerving. The Talani ambassador, a large and aggressive individual named Korath, stood up during one session and publicly accused the humans of treating the council as a surveillance platform, gathering intelligence while contributing nothing. Commander Beckett did not respond to the accusation. She simply made a note on her device and continued watching. I remember the exact moment when my curiosity turned to something sharper. It was late in the 4th month. I was reviewing the session transcripts in my quarters, as I did every evening, when I noticed a pattern that made my skin prickle. The human delegation did not just attend sessions, they attended every session, every subcommittee meeting, every working group, every classified briefing they were cleared to observe. They sat through the most tedious procedural debates I had ever endured, meetings that half the council delegates skipped because they were so mind-numbingly dull that even species with lifespans measured in millennia could not bear them. But the humans never missed one. I pulled up the attendance records going back 200 cycles. No species in the history of the council had achieved a perfect attendance record. Not one. Most delegations attended between 60 and 80% of all proceedings. The Kaloran, who prided ourselves on diligence and discipline, managed 91% in our best century. The humans attended 100%. They were not disengaged, they were not confused, they were not too primitive to understand. They were watching us with a focus and discipline that I had never seen from any species in my entire career. They observed our debates, our arguments, our procedures, our failures, and our stalemates, with the patient attention of scientists studying a specimen under glass. They catalogued our strengths and our weaknesses, and they did it without raising a single objection or asking a single question. And they said nothing. That night, I stood at the viewport of my quarters and looked out at the dead star around which the council station orbited. It was a cold, dark thing, a remnant of something that had once burned bright. I had lived beside it for so long that I had forgotten what it represented. Endings. Things that burn out because they stop moving, stop generating, stop creating. I dictated a message to the Speaker of the Chamber that evening. I recommended, for the first time in my career, that a new member species be placed under formal observation. The Speaker asked me why. I told him the truth. In 312 cycles, I have never seen a species sit in the chamber and simply watch us. It does not feel like diplomacy. It feels like reconnaissance. And it concerns me deeply that we do not know what they are preparing for. The Speaker approved my request within the hour. A classified file was opened on the human delegation, and I was placed in charge of it. But even then, standing at that viewport, with the cold light of a dead star on my face, I did not truly understand what was happening. None of us did. We thought the silence was the threat. We thought the refusal to speak was the weapon. We were wrong. The silence was not the weapon. It was the warning. And none of us were listening. The committee was called the Diplomatic Inquiry on Human Engagement. We gave it an official name because that is what the council does. We name things. We form committees. We schedule meetings to discuss the meetings we plan to have. I had spent my entire career inside this system, and I had always believed it was the highest expression of civilized governance. Problems arrive, we discuss them, we debate them, and eventually, after careful deliberation, we reach a solution. That is the way of the council. That has always been the way. But the humans had put a crack in that belief, and I could feel it widening with each passing day. The committee had 9 members. I served as chair. We had representatives from the Talani Hegemony, the Rythene Collective, the Orivari Elders, the Pelori Medical Union, and 4 other species with significant influence in council affairs. Our mandate was simple: find out what the humans wanted, find out why they refused to engage, and determine whether their silence represented a threat to galactic stability. Our first approach was direct. I sent a formal invitation to Commander Beckett, requesting a private meeting outside the chamber, away from the politics and the posturing. She accepted, which surprised me. We met in one of the small diplomatic lounges on the station's outer ring, a quiet room with a curved viewport looking out into deep space. I had chosen it deliberately. It was the most neutral, peaceful environment on the station. She arrived alone. No aides, no guards, no recording devices as far as I could detect. She sat across from me, folded her hands on the table, and waited. She did not fidget. She did not look around the room. She simply sat, completely still, and watched me with those gray eyes. I had prepared a careful speech. Diplomats always prepare speeches. I told her how much the Council valued humanity's presence. I expressed understanding that the pace of Council proceedings could be overwhelming for a species still new to galactic governance. I offered resources, translators, cultural advisors, anything that might help her delegation feel more comfortable participating in the democratic process that had governed the galaxy for thousands of years. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she tilted her head slightly, a gesture I later learned was common among humans when they were considering something, and said, "That is very generous, Counselor. Thank you." "Then you will consider engaging with the Council proceedings?" I asked, allowing myself a moment of hope. "No," she said, "but I appreciate the offer." I stared at her. In 3 centuries of diplomacy, I had never encountered a simple no, delivered with such calm certainty. There was no hostility in it, no arrogance. She was not trying to provoke me or test my patience. She simply meant it. The words sat between us like a stone. "Commander," I said, choosing my words carefully, "the Council has never had a member species that refused to participate in its proceedings. Our entire system is built on discussion, on the exchange of ideas, and the negotiation of shared interests. If you refuse to engage, then your membership serves no meaningful purpose." "Respectfully, Counselor," she said, "that depends entirely on what you think the purpose of membership is." I did not have a ready answer for that. The question was like a door I had never thought to open, and behind it I could sense something vast and uncomfortable. Over the following weeks, I tried every approach in the diplomatic repertoire I had accumulated over 3 centuries. I hosted a formal dinner for the human delegation and invited delegates from a dozen friendly species, hoping that the social atmosphere might lower their guard. The humans came, ate the food we provided with apparent enjoyment, made polite conversation about trivial subjects like stellar cartography and comparative biology, and left without committing to anything of substance. I arranged for a guided tour of the station's historical archives, thinking that seeing the Council's long record of achievements might inspire them to participate. Commander Beckett attended the tour, asked several intelligent questions about the archive's organizational system, examined the original treaty documents with what appeared to be genuine interest, and then returned to her quarters without a single word about future engagement. I tried informal approaches. I suggested walks through the station's botanical gardens. I offered tickets to a performance by the Pelori Harmonic Orchestra, which was considered the finest musical ensemble in the galaxy. I even invited Commander Beckett to a Kaleran meditation session, thinking that perhaps sharing a cultural experience might build the kind of personal trust that could lead to a breakthrough. She accepted the meditation session, sat in perfect stillness for the full 2 hours, thanked me warmly afterward, and still refused to discuss Council proceedings. I attempted to speak with the other members of her delegation individually, hoping that one of them might be more forthcoming than their commander. A young officer named Simon Grant was friendly and talkative about everything except the one thing I wanted to discuss. He told me about Earth, about its oceans and mountains, about a sport called football that seemed to involve a great deal of running and shouting, about a beverage called coffee that humans consumed in quantities I found alarming. But when I steered the conversation toward the delegation's silence in the Council, he smiled apologetically and said, "You would have to ask the commander about that." A woman named Lucy Marsh, who appeared to serve as the delegation's scientific advisor, was equally pleasant and equally impenetrable. She discussed quantum mechanics with impressive depth, asked thoughtful questions about Kaleran biology, and changed the subject with surgical precision every time I approached the topic of Council participation. Every door I opened led to another polite refusal. Every corridor ended in a wall made of smiles and courteous deflection. Meanwhile, the Council was growing restless. The Talani ambassador Korath gave a speech in the main chamber accusing humanity of espionage. He argued that their perfect attendance and constant note-taking proved they were gathering intelligence for a future military campaign. "They sit among us like predators studying prey," he said, his massive clawed hands gripping the podium, and his words drew murmurs of agreement from at least a third of the chamber. Several smaller delegations began avoiding the human section of the station entirely. The Rhythene Collective proposed a theory that humans communicated through hidden biological signals invisible to other species, and that their silence in the chamber did not mean they were not communicating. They suggested the human delegation might be transmitting council proceedings to a military command center on Earth in real time, turning our own debates into tactical intelligence. A technical scan of the human delegation's equipment found nothing to support this theory, but the Rhythene refused to let it go. Their collective mind had settled on suspicion, and a collective mind is difficult to redirect. The Aurivari remained silent on the matter. Their elder representative, a being named Thoran who was rumored to be over 9,000 years old, watched the proceedings with the same unreadable expression he wore for everything. His golden eyes tracked the debates about the humans, with the detachment of someone watching clouds pass. The Aurivari had a saying, "The river does not explain itself to the stones." I never understood what it meant until much later. I made one final attempt at direct engagement. I went to Commander Beckett's quarters unannounced late one evening, which was a violation of diplomatic protocol, but I had run out of conventional options. She opened the door, looked at me without surprise, as though she had been expecting me, and invited me in. Her quarters were simple. A desk with several of those compact human devices, their screens glowing faintly. A few personal items I did not recognize. A photograph on the wall showing a group of humans standing in front of a large body of water that glittered under a yellow sky. She saw me looking at it and said, "My family, that is the Pacific Ocean." "It is very large," I said, which was a foolish thing to say, but I was nervous and tired and running out of ideas. She smiled. Humans show their teeth when they smile, which is something I have never fully gotten used to. On most worlds, baring teeth is a warning, a display of aggression. On Earth, it means happiness. The contradiction says something important about humans, though I am still not sure what. I sat down across from her and abandoned all pretense of diplomatic strategy. "Commander," I said, "I am asking you directly, not as a counselor, not as a diplomat, not as the chair of any committee, as one person to another. What do you want? Why are you here?" She looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that feels like it reaches past your eyes and examines something behind them. Then she said, "We want what everyone wants, counselor. We want to survive." "Then work with us," I said, leaning forward. "The Council exists to ensure the survival and prosperity of all member species. That is its founding purpose. That is the reason we are all here." "Is it?" she said, and the question landed heavier than I expected. "Of course it is." She leaned back in her chair and studied me. "Your council has been debating the situation in the Veroth system for 60 years, counselor. 60 years of discussion, formal inquiries, subcommittees, position papers, advisory boards, impact assessments, budget reviews. 14 billion sentient beings live in that system, and their star is expanding. In a generation, maybe two, every planet in that system will be uninhabitable. The radiation alone will make the outer worlds lethal within a century." I opened my mouth to respond, but she continued, her voice calm and measured, without a trace of accusation. "How many of those 14 billion people have you evacuated?" I did not have a number. The Verath evacuation proposal was still in the preliminary assessment phase. It had been in the preliminary assessment phase for 11 years. Before that, it had spent 13 years in the feasibility study phase. Before that, it had been the subject of a special commission that had produced a 4,000-page report recommending further study. She did not wait for my answer. She did not need to. She already knew. The Korath 7th biosphere collapsed 30 years ago. Your environmental committee issued a report recommending intervention. The report is still under review. You have 4,000 species in this council, she said. 4,000 brilliant, ancient, powerful civilizations, with resources and technology that we cannot even begin to match. And you have turned governance into an art form so elaborate that the art has replaced the purpose. You do not solve problems, counselor. You discuss them. You discuss them until the people affected by them are gone, and then you discuss why they are gone, and then you form a committee to ensure it does not happen again. And then it happens again. And you discuss that too. I wanted to argue. I wanted to defend the council, the institution I had given my life to, the system I believed in with every fiber of my being. But her words cut through my defenses like a blade through silk, because they were precise, and because they were true. I could not refute a single thing she had said, because the evidence was in the council's own records. The same records I had reviewed thousands of times without ever seeing the pattern she had just described in under a minute. Commander, I said quietly, if you believe the council is failing, then help us reform it. Participate. Bring your perspective to the chamber. That is how change happens. She shook her head slowly. No, counselor. That is how change is delayed. We have seen your reform proposals. You have 63 of them pending. The oldest has been under consideration for 200 years. For the first time in 300 years, I questioned whether the system I served was the solution or the problem, whether the elegant machinery of debate and deliberation that I had dedicated my life to was a tool for progress or a monument to inaction, beautiful and intricate, and perfectly, tragically useless. But I did not have long to sit with that question, because 2 days later, the intelligence reports started arriving. The first report came from a Talani patrol vessel operating near the outer rim of mapped space. They had detected a convoy of human ships moving through an uninhabited sector at high speed. Not military vessels. The energy signatures were consistent with cargo transports and heavy engineering platforms. The kind of ships you would use to move enormous quantities of building materials. The patrol tried to hail them. The humans responded politely, confirmed their identity and heading, and continued on their course without stopping or slowing. The second report came from a Pelori research station in the Thenis sector. A cluster of human ships had passed through their long-range scanning envelope, moving in a tight formation toward the galactic south. Again, not warships. Construction rigs, fabrication platforms, resource haulers loaded with raw materials. The Pelori station commander noted in her report that the human fleet was moving with unusual coordination, as though every ship knew exactly where it was going and what it would do when it arrived. The third report was the one that made me stop breathing. A Rithian deep space sensor array, positioned at the edge of the Varath system for monitoring the dying star, detected a massive concentration of human vessels. Not 2 or 3 ships, not a dozen, not even 50, hundreds of them, perhaps more. The sensor data was incomplete, because the Varath system's expanding red giant created enormous electromagnetic interference, but the readings were unmistakable. Humanity had moved a full-scale industrial fleet into the most dangerous star system in the galaxy, the very system Commander Beckett had questioned me about just days before, and they had done it without informing anyone. I brought the reports to the committee. Korath, the Talani ambassador, slammed his clawed hand on the table hard enough to crack the surface and demanded an immediate military response. "This is exactly what I warned you about," he said, his crest fully extended in threat display. "They have been gathering intelligence from our proceedings, and now they are making their move. We must act before they establish a foothold." The Rythene delegate clicked her mandibles nervously. "What are they building? What could they possibly want in the Varath system? It is a graveyard waiting to happen." I looked at the data spread across my screen, and I thought about what Commander Beckett had said to me in her quarters. 14 billion people. How many have you evacuated? A cold feeling spread through me. Not the cold of fear, the cold of realization. The chamber erupted into exactly the kind of lengthy, passionate, fractured debate that it was designed for. Accusations flew in a dozen languages. Theories multiplied faster than they could be evaluated. Proposals were drafted, amended, rejected, redrafted, tabled, revived, and tabled again. And then, in the middle of the chaos, the Orovari elder Thoron raised his hand. The chamber fell silent immediately. Thoron had not requested the speaking floor in over 40 years. Seeing his ancient, weathered hand rise above the crowd was like watching a mountain shift. He did not speak. He simply looked at the speaker, then turned his golden eyes toward the human delegation's seats and lowered his hand. Commander Beckett sat there, as she always did, watching and listening. She made no move to address the chamber. The speaker, following Thoron's silent suggestion, addressed her directly. "Commander Beckett, the Council has received reports of significant human activity in the Varath system and other regions of Council space. This Council formally requests an explanation." Nora Beckett stood, every eye, every sensor, every antenna in the chamber focused on her. The silence was so complete, I could hear the hum of the station's life support systems. She sat down. The chamber erupted. Korath roared that this was an act of open defiance against the authority of the council itself. The Rithene buzzed in collective agitation, their segmented bodies vibrating at frequencies that made the floor tremble. Even the normally composed Pelori delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats and exchanged worried glances. A motion was raised, for the first time in council history, to compel a member species to participate in discussion. The vote was overwhelming, 89% in favor. A formal summons was drafted, sealed with the full authority of the Galactic Council, and hand-delivered to Commander Beckett by the Speaker himself, in front of the entire assembly. She read it carefully. She folded it neatly along precise lines. She looked up at the Speaker and said, "We respectfully decline." The Speaker stood frozen at the podium. In 4,000 years of Council history, no species had ever refused a formal summons. There was no procedure for it, no protocol, no contingency plan, no precedent to consult. The entire system was built on the assumption that every species wanted to talk. Because talking was what civilized beings did. Talking was the foundation of everything. The humans had just told the most powerful governing body in the galaxy that they would not be speaking, and there was nothing in 4,000 years of rules and regulations and carefully maintained precedent that told us what to do next. I stood in the upper ring, watching Commander Beckett walk calmly out of the chamber with her delegation, 7 humans moving in their tight formation through a sea of 4,000 stunned aliens, and I felt something I had not felt in 300 years. Not of what the humans might say, but of what they were doing while the rest of us were still talking. I volunteered for the reconnaissance mission because I could not stand another day of sitting in that chamber, listening to 4,000 species argue about what the humans were doing, when we could simply go and look. The mission was authorized within a day of Commander Beckett's refusal of the summons. A small fleet of Council observation vessels, 12 ships from 8 different species, would travel to the Verath system and report on human activity. The Pelori were chosen to lead because they were considered the least threatening species in the Council. Sending a Talani warship to investigate would have been provocative. Sending a Pelori medical cruiser sent a message of curiosity rather than confrontation. The journey took 9 days through faster-than-light corridors. I spent most of that time in my cabin, reviewing every piece of data we had on the Verath system. The facts were bleak. Varath Prime was a red giant in the late stages of stellar expansion. Within the next 80 to 100 years, it would consume the inner 3 planets entirely and render the outer 4 uninhabitable through radiation alone. 14 billion sentient beings lived across those worlds, mostly Varath natives, a quiet, gentle species of tall, thin beings, with silver-blue skin and voices that sounded like wind chimes in a light breeze. They had never developed faster-than-light travel on their own. They had been council members for over 1,000 years, granted membership on the basis of their extraordinary contributions to mathematics, music, and philosophical thought. For 60 years, the council had debated how to save them. Proposals had been submitted, reviewed, amended, sent back for revision, resubmitted, and tabled for further consideration. The central question, who would fund the evacuation and where the refugees would be resettled, had generated over 3,000 position papers, 12 special commissions, 46 subcommittee reports, and not a single transport ship. 14 billion people, waiting patiently for a galaxy of talkers to stop talking and do something. We dropped out of faster-than-light speed at the edge of the Varath system, and I pressed my face to the viewport so hard that the cold of the glass stung my skin. My first thought was that we had made a navigation error. The Varath system I had studied in briefing documents was a dying place. A swollen red star bleeding radiation across barren worlds. A slow-motion catastrophe observed by billions who could not escape it. A tragedy in progress, documented in detail, discussed at length, and left unaddressed. What I saw through that viewport was a construction site the size of a solar system. Cargo vessels the size of small moons crawled between orbital structures, offloading materials I did not recognize. Engineering rigs the length of city blocks moved in precise formation, welding together the skeletal frameworks of massive orbital habitats with streams of bright blue energy. Solar shielding arrays, enormous reflective panels designed to deflect stellar radiation away from the construction zones, were being towed into position around the inner system by coordinated teams of ships, working in formations that looked almost choreographed. And the habitats. I had seen orbital habitats before. Every advanced species built them. But I had never seen anything like this. These were not temporary shelters or emergency platforms or bare-bones survival stations. They were cities. Complete, self-sustaining cities suspended in the void of space, with residential districts, agricultural sections, water reclamation systems, power generators, parks, schools, and medical facilities. Some were still skeletal frameworks of exposed metal and wiring, swarming with construction drones and human workers in environmental suits. But others were finished, fully operational, lit from within by warm golden light, and when we adjusted our sensors to look closer, we could see movement inside them. People, Varath people, families, already living in the completed habitats. The captain of the Gentle Inquiry, a Pelori named Sethka, turned to me, with an expression I can only describe as bewildered shock. "Counselor Driss, are you seeing this?" I was seeing it. I was not believing it, but I was seeing it. A cheerful voice, male, speaking in the common galactic trade language, with a noticeable human accent. Council Vessel Gentle Inquiry. This is the cargo ship Horizon's Edge. Welcome to Verath. How can we help you? The captain identified us and stated our mission. We were an official Council observation fleet, authorized to monitor and report on activity in the system. The human on the other end said, "Understood. You are welcome to approach and observe. We have nothing to hide, and if you need fuel or supplies, we have a resupply station at the coordinates I am sending you now. No charge. No charge. They were offering us free fuel in a system where they were conducting an operation of staggering scale, burning through resources at a rate that would have bankrupted most species. The casual generosity of it stunned me almost as much as the habitats themselves. We spent 3 days in the Verath system. What we found during those 3 days changed everything I believed about the galaxy and about the species that called themselves human. On the first day, we toured one of the completed habitats. A human engineer named Peter Hale met us at the docking bay with a firm handshake and a wide smile. He was a young man, probably in his early 30s by human reckoning, with calloused hands that spoke of manual labor and dark circles under his eyes that told of long hours and little rest. He wore a simple work uniform stained with machine lubricant and greeted us as though we were neighbors visiting for tea rather than an official investigation team from the highest governing body in the galaxy. He walked us through the habitat, explaining its systems with obvious pride, water recycling units that could process waste fluid back to drinking purity in under an hour, atmospheric processors that maintained a perfect replica of the Verath homeworld's air composition, gravity generators calibrated to match Verath surface conditions, food production bays that could feed 10,000 people using hydroponic farming techniques humans had apparently perfected on their own colony ships during the long decades before they achieved faster-than-light travel. The habitat was designed to house 50,000 Verath citizens and was already at 70% capacity. As we walked through a residential corridor, Verath families moved around us, going about the ordinary business of living. Children ran between doorways. A group of elderly Verath sat in a common area, playing a board game I recognized from Council Cultural Archives. The smell of cooking food drifted from an open kitchen, where a Verath woman was preparing a meal using ingredients grown in the station's own agricultural bays. We have 32 completed habitats in the system, Peter told us, as we passed through a small park area that had been built into the station's central atrium. Actual trees grew there, imported from Verath nurseries, their roots embedded in engineered soil, their silver-green leaves reaching toward artificial sunlight that mimicked their native star, as it had been before it began to die. Another 40 are under construction. We expect to have capacity for 9 billion within 18 months. I stopped walking. 9 billion? He looked at me as though the number was obvious, as though it required no special comment. Well, yes, 14 billion total in the system, so we need to keep building. But 9 billion gets us past the critical threshold. The inner worlds need to be evacuated first, because the radiation levels are already reaching dangerous thresholds. The outer worlds have about another 60 years before conditions become truly lethal. So we have time for the remaining 5 billion. But the inner worlds are the immediate priority. Sethka, the Pelori captain, asked the question I was too stunned to form. How long have you been doing this? Peter thought for a moment, rubbing the back of his neck. The first construction ship arrived about 11 months ago. The commander sent an advance team with engineering supplies while the delegation was still getting settled at the council station. We had the first habitat framework up within 3 weeks of arrival. 11 months. They had been building for 11 months, while their ambassador sat in silence in the council chamber, listening to debates about trade tariffs and border disputes and cultural exchange programs. Her people had been constructing a constellation of orbital cities to save a civilization that the council had spent 6 decades discussing how to help. Why? I asked. The word came out as barely a whisper. My voice did not want to cooperate with my lungs. Why are you doing this? Peter Hale looked at me with genuine confusion, as though the question itself did not make sense to him. As though the answer was so obvious that asking required explanation, not the answer itself. Because someone had to, he said. And you all seemed busy talking about it. I stood in that park, surrounded by silver-leaf trees and Verath children, and artificial sunlight, and I could not speak. On the second day, we received additional intelligence from Council sources and our own fleet's long-range sensors about human activity in other regions of the galaxy. I read those reports in my cabin on the gentle inquiry, sitting in the dark, because I did not want anyone to see the expression on my face. In the Drimok corridor, where pirate warlords had terrorized merchant shipping lanes for over a century, humans had established armed convoy escorts. They had not declared war on the pirates. They had not issued ultimatums, or drawn up enforcement proposals, or requested a council mandate. They had simply started flying alongside merchant vessels from any species that requested protection, providing security for the duration of the transit. The pirate attacks in escorted lanes had dropped by 80% in 4 months. Merchants from 12 different species were already scheduling their shipments to coincide with human escort availability, and the economic impact was measurable. Trade volume through the corridor had doubled. On Korath 7th, the dead world with the collapsed biosphere that the Council's Environmental Committee had been reviewing for 30 years, humans had deployed autonomous terraforming drones. Thousands of them, small and tireless, working around the clock, enriching soil that had been barren ash, seeding the thin atmosphere with carefully calibrated gas mixtures designed to gradually rebuild a breathable environment, planting engineered organisms designed to jumpstart a functioning ecosystem from the ground up. A Pelori survey team had visited the surface 2 weeks prior and reported something that made my chest ache when I read it. Green shoots. Tiny, fragile, impossible green shoots pushing up through centuries of ash and sterile dust. Life, returning to a world the Council had classified as permanently lost. In the Thessan refugee zone, where displaced populations from 3 different regional conflicts lived in overcrowded temporary shelters that had been called temporary for 40 years, humans had built a medical station, fully staffed with human doctors and nurses who had volunteered for the assignment, fully equipped with diagnostic and surgical equipment adapted for multiple species. They were treating patients from 17 different biological types, species whose anatomies humans had only learned about a year ago. A human doctor named Lucy Marsh, the same woman from the delegation who had discussed quantum mechanics with me, had apparently spent 6 consecutive months studying alien physiology from Council medical databases before designing treatment protocols that local physicians confirmed were not only competent, but innovative. I set down the reports and stared at the dark wall of my cabin. My hands were shaking, not from fear, not from anger, from something else. Something I did not have a word for in my language. The closest translation I could construct later, after much thought, was the pain of seeing clearly, after a lifetime of comfortable blindness. On the 3rd day, I requested a private meeting with the senior human officer in the Verith system. Her name was Captain Helen Cole, a compact woman with short brown hair and an economy of movement that suggested military training. We met in her office aboard the command ship, a room that was almost aggressively functional. No decorations, no art, no ceremonial objects or diplomatic gifts displayed on shelves. Just screens displaying real-time construction progress, resource allocation charts, personnel rosters, and communication logs. Every surface served a purpose. Nothing was wasted. "Captain Cole," I said, "I need to understand something. Your species has been a member of the Galactic Council for barely over a year. You have no significant military presence compared to the major powers. You have no established alliance network. You have no trade agreements, and therefore no formal economic partnerships. And yet you are conducting simultaneous large-scale operations across multiple star systems that would strain the resources and logistics of species 1,000 times your age. How is this possible?" She considered the question for a moment, her eyes steady on mine. "We did not wait for permission, Counselor. That helps. But the resources, the ships, the materials, the trained personnel, where is it all coming from?" "We redirected about 30% of our colonial expansion budget," she said, as though describing a minor scheduling adjustment. "Delayed the settlement of 2 new star systems by a few years, shifted some of our deep space exploration fleet to construction duty. It was not a difficult decision. The Colonial Development Board reviewed the intelligence our delegation sent back from the Council and voted on the reallocation in 1 afternoon. 1 afternoon. The thought kept echoing in my mind. 60 years of council debate on the Varath crisis alone, thousands of position papers, hundreds of committee sessions, and the humans had made their decision in a single afternoon. Were you not concerned about the political consequences? I asked. Acting in council space without authorization is a serious breach of galactic protocol. You could be censured, sanctioned, expelled from the council. Captain Cole looked at me steadily, without a trace of defiance or bravado. Councillor Driss, there are 14 billion people in this system, whose star is going to swallow their worlds. We could have asked permission and waited for the council to debate it for another 60 years, while radiation levels climbed, and the first planetary evacuations became necessary, and still no ships came. Or, we could start building right now, today, with what we had. We chose to build. If the council wants to censure us for saving 14 billion lives, then the council can explain to those 14 billion people why it would rather have them wait. I had no response to that. Because she was right. And the worst part was not that she was right. The worst part was that she was not even angry about it. She was not resentful or self-righteous. She stated it as a simple fact, the way one might state that gravity pulls things downward, or that stars eventually burn out. The council talked, humans acted, and the gap between those two things was not an abstract philosophical difference. It was measured in real lives saved and real lives lost. I returned to the council with my report. I presented my findings to the full chamber, with visual evidence, sensor data, structural analysis of the habitats, and personal testimony from the Pelori crew who had walked through them with me. The chamber erupted. The reaction split along exactly the lines I expected. The Talani were furious. Korath rose from his seat, his crest fully extended in what his species intended as a display of righteous outrage, and thundered that humanity had violated council sovereignty by conducting unauthorized operations in member systems. He demanded immediate sanctions, expulsion from the council, and a military response to contain what he called the human threat. The Rythene were confused and alarmed. Their collective minds struggled to process the idea that a single species could act unilaterally on such a scale, without committee approval, without feasibility studies, without impact assessments, without any of the procedural safeguards that every civilized species understood were necessary before taking action. It violated everything they understood about how governance worked. The Pelori delegation, however, was quiet. Sethka had been on that mission with me. She had walked through those habitats. She had seen the silver-leafed trees in the park, and the Varath children running through corridors, and the elderly playing board games in common rooms that had not existed 5 months ago. When Korath demanded sanctions, Sethka stood from her seat and said, in a voice that carried across the entire chamber, "I will not vote to punish a species for doing what we should have done 60 years ago." That cracked the chamber open like a fissure through stone. 17 species that had directly benefited from human action rose in support of the Pelori position. Species whose merchants now traveled safely through the Drimac corridor for the first time in living memory. Species whose refugees in the Thesson zone now had medical care that they had been promised and denied for decades. Species whose environmental reports on Korath 7th now contained the word recovery instead of decline for the first time in 30 years. The censure vote failed. And for the first time in recorded history, the Galactic Council could not reach consensus on a major resolution. The institution that prided itself on discussion, on deliberation, on the elegant ancient art of reaching agreement through patience and wisdom, was paralyzed. Not by an external threat, not by a military crisis, by the simple, devastating fact that while they had been talking, someone else had been doing. And the results spoke louder than any speech ever delivered in that chamber. That night, alone in my quarters, I pulled up the council's complete session archive on my personal terminal. Every debate, every motion, every committee report from the past century. I spent hours scrolling through it, counting entries, tallying outcomes. I counted the problems identified. Then I counted the problems discussed. Then I counted the problems actually solved. The first number was enormous. The second number was nearly as large. The third number was so small it fit on a single screen with room to spare. I turned off my display and sat in the dark for a very long time, listening to the hum of the station and the distant pulse of the dead star's residual radiation. Outside my viewport, the cold remnant that the Council orbited sat dark and silent in the void, a monument to things that stop burning because they stop moving, stop creating, stop doing. I thought about Commander Nora Beckett sitting in that chamber day after day, listening to us talk, taking her notes, watching with those gray eyes, and I finally understood the expression she wore during our debates, the one I had spent months trying to interpret. It was not contempt. It was not arrogance. It was not impatience or disdain. It was grief. She was grieving for every life lost, while we perfected the art of saying nothing beautifully. The summons arrived on a morning that felt no different from any other. The Council had spent 3 full days drafting it. 3 days to produce a single document demanding that humanity address the chamber. 3 days of debate over the wording, the tone, the legal framework, the jurisdictional precedent it would set, the implications for future enforcement actions. 3 days, when the simple version could have been written in 3 minutes. Come to the floor and explain yourselves. This was not the previous summons, the one Commander Beckett had folded and politely declined. This was something heavier. The Council had invoked Article 7, an emergency provision that had been used only twice in 4,000 years of Council history. Under Article 7, a member species that refused to address the chamber on a matter officially designated as being of galactic significance could be suspended from the Council entirely. Their seat would be revoked. Their diplomatic protections would end. They would become, in the eyes of galactic law, an outsider species with no standing in Council space. The message was clear: speak or leave. I did not want it sent through official channels, where it would be processed by some administrative clerk who did not understand the weight of the moment. She opened the door, saw the document in my hand, and studied my face for a moment. Then she stepped aside and let me in. Article 7, she said, reading the first line. It is worth something, Counselor. Thank you. Commander, I must be direct with you. If you refuse this summons, the Council will suspend humanity's membership. You will lose your seat, your diplomatic protections, and any legal standing in Council space. Everything your people have built in the Varath system, the Dreamok Corridor, on Korath 7, all of it could be legally classified as unauthorized foreign construction and seized or dismantled. She set the document down on her desk and looked at me with those gray eyes. Could be, but would it be? I hesitated. She was right, as she always seemed to be right. The 17 species that had voted against censure would not stand for it. Seizing the Varath habitats would mean evicting billions of refugees from their new homes. Shutting down the Dreamok escorts would mean abandoning merchant convoys to pirate fleets. Dismantling the Korath 7th terraforming operation would mean letting a recovering world die again. No delegation would agree to that, no matter how angry their government was. No, I admitted. Probably not. Then the suspension is symbolic, she said. And symbols do not build habitats or grow crops on dead worlds. Commander. Please. I heard the desperation in my own voice and did not care. I am asking you, not as a counselor. Just address the chamber. Tell them what you told me in this room. Tell them why you did what you did. Help them understand. She was quiet for a long time. She looked at the photograph of her family by the Pacific Ocean, and I saw something pass across her face that I had not seen before. A softening. A decision being reached, not through logic or strategy, but through something deeper. All right, Counselor, she said. We will speak. The session was scheduled for the following day. Word spread through the station like fire through dry grass. Every delegate, every aide, every support staff member who could find a reason or an excuse to be in the chamber made sure they were there. The galleries were packed beyond capacity. Species that normally sent only their primary delegates dispatched their full contingents. The Rhythene brought an additional 300 hive members, their segmented bodies filling an entire section of the upper ring until it looked like a living wall of chitinous shells. The chamber hummed with nervous energy, unlike anything I had felt in 3 centuries. I took my seat in the diplomatic section and watched the human delegation enter. All 7 of them, walking in their tight single-file formation, Commander Beckett at the lead. She wore a clean uniform, pressed and precise, and her expression was calm, composed. Whatever she was feeling, she kept it behind those gray eyes. The speaker called the session to order. The formalities were brief, mercifully. Then he turned to the human delegation and said, Commander Nora Beckett, representative of the human species, you have the floor. She stood, walked to the central speaking platform with measured steps that echoed in the silent chamber. Looked out at 4,000 delegates from 4,000 species, the collected representatives of millions of years of combined civilization. And for a moment, she said nothing. The silence stretched. I could feel the tension like a physical weight pressing down on every being in the room. Then she reached for the holographic display controls built into the speaking platform and activated them. No one expected that. Delegates usually spoke from the platform. They argued. They presented data, cited precedent, made impassioned appeals, constructed elaborate logical frameworks. They did not use the holographic display system, which was mostly there for ceremonial presentations, and was rarely activated during actual debate. The chamber filled with light. A live feed appeared, projected across the massive curved screens that lined the chamber walls from floor to ceiling. It showed the interior of a Vareth orbital habitat, not a construction schematic, not an architectural rendering, a live image, transmitted in real time from the Vareth system across thousands of light-years to the chamber where 4,000 species sat watching. Families moved through a residential corridor. Vareth children, small and silver-skinned with their delicate features and dark liquid eyes, chased each other through a garden area where real flowers bloomed in engineered soil. An elderly Vareth woman sat on a bench under an artificial sky, her eyes closed, her thin face tilted upward toward light that mimicked the warmth of the sun, as it had been before it started dying. She was smiling, the gentle, private smile of someone who feels safe. Commander Beckett said nothing. She let the image speak. Then she switched the feed. A new image appeared. Korath 7th, seen from orbit. The planet's surface, which in every council database was recorded as gray and lifeless and classified as permanently lost, showed patches of green, scattered, small, fragile, but unmistakably alive. The camera zoomed in, and the chamber watched as a thin rain fell over ground that had not known moisture in 400 years. The first natural rainfall on a world that every study, every committee report, every expert assessment had declared beyond recovery. Another feed, the Dreamok Corridor, a convoy of merchant vessels from 6 different species traveling in formation, their running lights blinking in the darkness of deep space, flanked by human escort ships that held their positions with quiet, steady precision. The convoy moved through a sector that had been a killing ground for pirate fleets for over a century, a stretch of space where merchants once flew with dread in their hearts and prayers on their lips. It moved safely, smoothly, without incident. A Talani freighter captain could be seen through his cockpit window, looking out at the human escort beside him, and even from a distance, his expression was readable. It was gratitude. Another feed. The Thesson Refugee Zone, a medical facility, clean and bright and bustling with activity, filled with patients from a dozen species being treated by human medical staff, working seamlessly alongside local healers from the refugee populations. A Rhythene hatchling, born with a developmental condition that would have been terminal without surgical intervention, took its first careful steps in a rehabilitation ward, while its parent watched from the doorway, mandibles clicking in what I had learned was the Rhythene expression of overwhelming joy. Another feed. A deep space construction platform where human and Vareth engineers worked side by side, assembling the framework of yet another orbital habitat. A human woman, in a welding suit, waved at the camera, and gave a gesture that Simon Grant had once told me was called a thumbs up, a sign of optimism and encouragement. A Vareth worker beside her tried to mimic the gesture with his longer, thinner fingers, and did not quite manage it, and they both laughed. The laughter needed no translation. Commander Beckett let the images play for 3 full minutes. 3 minutes of silence in a chamber that had never been silent for that long in its entire 4,000-year history. I watched the faces of the delegates around me. The Talani ambassador Korath stared at the screens with his mouth open and his crest flat against his skull, all aggression drained from his posture. The Rhythene collective had gone completely still, every one of their 300 members frozen in place like a sculpture of collective astonishment. The Pelori delegate Ureth Sol had tears running down his face, clear fluid that dripped from his lower eyes and pooled on his collar, and he made no move to wipe them away. Then Commander Beckett spoke. "You asked me to discuss, so here is my discussion." Her voice was steady, not loud, not aggressive, not bitter or triumphant, just steady, the way a foundation is steady when it holds up everything built on top of it. 60 years, the Council debated the Varath crisis. 60 years of proposals and position papers, and committee reviews, and budget assessments. We resolved it in 11 months, not because we are smarter than you, not because we are stronger or more advanced, but because we decided that 14 billion lives were more important than procedure. She paused, the silence held. A century, the Council negotiated pirate suppression in the Dreamok Corridor, 100 years of diplomatic initiatives, and enforcement proposals, and jurisdictional disputes, and budget allocation debates. We escorted our first convoy 9 weeks after we arrived in the region. Not because your plans were bad. Many of them were excellent plans. Thorough, well-researched, carefully considered. They simply never left the page they were written on. Another pause. 30 years. The Council reviewed the Korath's 7th biosphere collapse. 30 years of environmental assessments and feasibility studies and budget projections and review panels. We planted the first seed 8 months ago. It rained there last week. The first rain in 4 centuries on a world you had given up on. She turned slowly on the platform, her gray eyes moving across every section of the chamber, meeting the gaze of delegates who had spent their entire careers in this room, who had built their identities around the art of discussion and debate and deliberation. We did not refuse your discussions because we do not respect you. We refused because while you discuss, people suffer. While committees are formed, homes are lost. While position papers are drafted and reviewed, and revised and tabled and reconsidered, children grow up in refugee camps that were supposed to be temporary 40 years ago. Her voice remained calm. There was no accusation in it, no anger, no self-righteousness, no satisfaction. Just truth, delivered without decoration, without embellishment, without a single unnecessary word. We decided, as a species, that we would rather be judged for acting without permission than praised for talking without action. She stepped back from the podium. The holographic feeds continued to play silently on the chamber walls. Veroth families eating dinner in their new homes. Green shoots on a dead world. Safe convoys in dangerous space. A child taking her first steps in a medical facility that existed because someone decided to build it instead of discussing whether to build it. The quiet, undeniable evidence of what happens when a civilization stops debating and starts doing. The silence that followed was the deepest I have ever experienced. 4,000 delegates, representatives of civilizations that spanned millions of years of combined history, beings who had devoted their lives to the power and beauty of words, sat without a single word to say. Then Thoron, the Orovari elder, stood. The chamber gasped. Not a whispered intake of breath, an audible, collective, involuntary gasp that echoed off the vaulted ceiling and rolled back across the assembly like a wave. Thoron had not spoken in the council chamber in over 40 years. Some younger delegates had never heard his voice. Some had quietly assumed he could no longer speak. He was ancient, beyond easy comprehension, a being who had watched empires rise and crumble, and rise again across timescales that most species could not imagine, and he had chosen silence as his response to a galaxy that would not stop producing words. He rose slowly from his seat, his long weathered frame unfolding like a structure reassembling itself from rest. His eyes, deep gold and impossibly old, carrying the weight of 9,000 years of watching, looked first at Commander Beckett and then at the rest of the chamber. He spoke one sentence. His voice was low and rough, like wind moving through ancient stone, and it carried to every corner of the vast room without effort. Perhaps it is we who had nothing to discuss. Then he sat down. The speaker called a recess. I am not sure he had a choice. The emotional weight in that chamber was too heavy for proceedings to continue. Delegates rose from their seats in a daze. Some walked out silently, their faces blank with the particular emptiness that comes from having a fundamental belief shattered. Others stood in clusters, speaking in hushed tones. A few wept openly, though whether from shame or relief or the strange mixture of both, I could not tell. During the recess, I stood in the corridor outside the chamber and watched something extraordinary unfold. Delegates began approaching the human delegation, not to argue, not to accuse, not to demand explanations or assert jurisdictional authority, to offer. They are doing nothing. Tell us where to send them. A Pelori medical admiral appeared with a datapad already prepared, listing 3 hospital ships and their complete staff rosters, ready for immediate deployment to the Thessan refugee zone, or anywhere else they were needed. A pair of Talani captains, not the ambassador Korath, but active military officers acting on their own initiative, quietly approached Simon Grant and handed him a data chip. It contained navigational charts for the Dreamok corridor, detailed patrol routes, and safe passages that the Talani military had never shared with any other species in their entire history as a spacefaring civilization. Even species I did not expect stepped forward. The Virathi, a famously isolationist people who had barely spoken to anyone outside their own borders for centuries, offered to open 3 of their worlds to Veroth refugees. The Dremak, who had not participated in a joint operation with another species in 600 years, pledged 5 full engineering battalions. I stood in that corridor and watched the galaxy change. Not through a vote, not through a treaty, not through a carefully worded resolution passed after months of debate. It changed because one species had shown everyone else that the gap between words and action was not a philosophical abstraction to be discussed in seminar rooms and debating chambers. It was measured in lives saved and lives lost, and every being in that corridor could feel, deep in whatever passed for their bones, which side of that gap they wanted to stand on. Commander Beckett moved through the crowd, accepting each offer with a nod and a simple thank you. I caught her eye as she passed me. She paused. "Counselor Driss," she said, "thank you for delivering the summons." "You are welcome, Commander. For what it is worth, I am glad you decided to speak." She gave me that teeth-baring human smile. I did not say much. "No," I agreed. "You showed us instead. That was infinitely better." She nodded once and moved on, and I stood in that corridor feeling something old and calcified crack open inside my chest. The belief that talking was enough. The faith that discussion equaled progress. The comfortable illusion that a well-reasoned argument about building a shelter was the same thing as a shelter built. The humans did not bring a weapon to the council. They did not bring a threat, or an ultimatum, or a demand. They brought something far more dangerous than any of those things. They brought results. And results, it turned out, were the one thing the council had never learned how to argue with. 1 year passed. I marked it on my personal calendar, a habit I had developed from spending time around humans. They were obsessed with measuring time, carving it into days and weeks and months and anniversaries, as though by counting the moments, they could make each one carry more weight. Given that their natural lifespans were so short compared to most galactic species, perhaps they were right. Perhaps things matter more when you know you will not have them forever. The Galactic Council still existed. The Grand Chamber still orbited the dead star. 4,000 species still held seats in the Great Ring. But walking through the station on the anniversary of Commander Beckett's address to the chamber, I barely recognized the place. The most visible change was the new wing. It had been built in the 6 months following the speech, constructed with speed that would have been unthinkable under the old system, by a joint team of human structural engineers, Rythene construction drones, and Orovari architects. It was attached to the eastern arc of the station, a gleaming addition that looked almost organic, next to the ancient ceremonial stonework of the original structure. The Auravari had insisted on designing the entrance, creating a sweeping archway of pale stone, inscribed with a single phrase in their ancient script. Translated loosely, it read, "Enter to act." They called it the Action Hall. It was not a replacement for the council chamber. The chamber still functioned. Debates still happened. Treaties were still negotiated, and trade agreements were still hammered out in the traditional fashion. The art of diplomacy and deliberation had not been discarded, but the Action Hall operated alongside it on a different principle entirely, one that would have been unthinkable a year ago. Any crisis brought before the council was now given 90 days. 90 days to be debated, discussed, analyzed, and resolved through traditional diplomatic means. If, at the end of those 90 days, no resolution had been achieved and no concrete action had been taken, the matter was automatically transferred to the Action Hall. And the Action Hall did not debate, it mobilized. A rotating coalition of volunteer species maintained standing resources in the hall: ships, medical teams, engineering corps, emergency supplies, construction materials, all pre-committed and ready for deployment at short notice. When a matter was transferred from the chamber, a coordinator chosen from the volunteering species on a rotating basis had 72 hours to assemble a response plan and begin operations. Not 72 days, not 72 committee sessions, 72 hours. The system was not perfect. Nothing built by 4,000 species in 6 months could be perfect. There were arguments about jurisdiction, about which species would lead which response, about how resources should be allocated when multiple crises competed for attention. The Talani, predictably, complained that the 90-day window was too short and undermined the deliberative process that had served the galaxy for millennia. The Rhythene, equally predictably, thought 90 days was too long and wanted it reduced to 30. But it worked. Not elegantly, not smoothly, not with the polished grace of the old system, but it worked in the way that matters most. Problems were addressed. Suffering was reduced. Things got done. A water shortage on the colony world of Thesson 4, that had been under review for a decade, was resolved in 3 weeks when a joint Pelori-human team installed atmospheric moisture extractors across the affected regions. A territorial dispute between 2 minor species in the Outer Rim that had generated 14 years of legal briefs, counter-briefs, and procedural challenges was settled in 40 days when both sides realized that the Action Hall would simply impose a practical, equitable solution if they could not agree on one themselves. They found their agreement remarkably quickly after that. It was extraordinary how motivating a deadline could be. Some of my colleagues in the diplomatic corps viewed this as a demotion, a step down from the prestigious committee chairs and mediation roles I had held for centuries. I viewed it as the most meaningful work I had done in 313 years of service. For the first time in my career, the problems I worked on had outcomes, not just proceedings. It was in this new role that I received an invitation to visit Earth. I had seen images of the human homeworld, of course. Every council delegate had access to the standard briefing materials, a small rocky planet, third from an unremarkable yellow star in an unremarkable arm of an unremarkable spiral galaxy, thin nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere, large surface oceans covering roughly 70% of the globe, a bewildering variety of climatic zones packed onto a single world, ranging from frozen polar regions to scorching equatorial deserts, from dense tropical forests to vast arid plains. The briefing materials described it as adequate for carbon-based life and notable primarily for the unusual aggressiveness and adaptability of its dominant species. The briefing materials did not prepare me for the reality. I arrived on a human transport ship that touched down at a facility they called a spaceport, though it looked more like a small city built around a series of landing platforms. The noise hit me first. Humans were loud. Not in the way the Talani were loud, with deep rumbling vocalizations designed to carry across vast distances. Humans were loud in every direction simultaneously and at every frequency. They talked over each other in overlapping streams of conversation that seemed incomprehensible and yet somehow communicated meaning. They laughed at volumes that seemed medically inadvisable. They played music from devices they carried in their pockets. Different songs from different devices clashing in the air, without anyone seeming to mind. Children shouted, machines hummed, vehicles growled and honked. The entire planet seemed to vibrate with uncontrolled energy. The visual experience was equally overwhelming. The spaceport was located near a large coastal city, and the view from the landing platform showed a staggering density of human civilization. Buildings of every conceivable size, shape, and architectural style crowded together in patterns that appeared completely random, but somehow functioned as a coherent whole. Ground vehicles moved through streets in flowing rivers of metal and glass, stopping and starting in rhythms governed by colored light signals that the humans obeyed with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Humans walked everywhere, in groups, alone, in pairs holding hands, with small four-legged companion animals that I later learned were called dogs. Dogs were a revelation in themselves. Humans had apparently formed an ancient partnership with these creatures, based on mutual affection and a shared enthusiasm for chasing things. The dogs seemed to adore their human companions, with an intensity that bordered on worship, and the humans returned the affection with equal fervor. I watched a large man in work clothing kneel down on a busy street to scratch behind the ears of a small, fluffy dog, speaking to it in a soft, loving voice, completely at odds with his rough exterior, and I thought, this species is more complicated than any briefing document could capture. My guide was a young man named Owen Clark. He worked for the human government's newly established Galactic Relations Office and had been assigned to make my visit productive and pleasant. He was enthusiastic, slightly nervous, and had clearly been given very specific instructions to make a good impression without being too obvious about it. He was not entirely successful at the second part. "Welcome to Earth, Counselor," he said as I descended the ramp from the transport. "I hope the trip was comfortable." "It was adequate," I said, which was true. Human ships were functional, but not luxurious. They prioritized speed, efficiency, and cargo capacity over passenger comfort, which told you everything you needed to know about what this species valued. Getting things done mattered more to them than being comfortable while doing it. Owen took me on a tour of the city. I observed humans in their natural habitat with the same careful attention I had once directed at council proceedings. In a single afternoon, I witnessed a heated disagreement between two humans at an outdoor food stall about the correct way to prepare a food item called a sandwich. A passionate debate between three complete strangers on a public transit vehicle about the policies of their local government, and a full-volume shouting match between two vehicle operators who had apparently disagreed about the rules of traffic at an intersection. The sandwich argument alone went on for 10 minutes and involved hand gestures, raised voices, and appeals to tradition that would not have been out of place in the council chamber. Owen noticed my alarm during the shouting match between the vehicle operators and said reassuringly, "Oh, do not worry about that. That is just traffic. They will forget about it in 5 minutes and go about their day." He was right. The two operators, who had appeared moments from some kind of physical confrontation, exchanged a rude hand gesture each and drove away in opposite directions, the entire incident dismissed and forgotten before they reached the next intersection. "You argue with each other more than the council argues with itself," I observed. Owen laughed, a short burst of genuine amusement. "That is probably true, but we also make up faster, and more importantly, we do not let the argument stop us from getting things done." We can disagree about which direction to go while still walking. That struck me as perhaps the most profound thing any human had said to me, and Owen had not even seemed to realize he was being profound. I sat in the public gallery and watched 9 humans spend 2 hours in vigorous, occasionally heated, occasionally chaotic discussion about road maintenance, public park funding, and whether a proposed residential building was too tall for its neighborhood. The debate was disorderly by council standards. Members interrupted each other. They made emotional appeals. One woman stood up and delivered a passionate 5-minute speech about a specific old tree that the proposed building would cast in shadow, arguing that the tree had stood in that location for over 100 years and deserved consideration as a living landmark. Another member responded that a 100-year-old tree, while lovely, should not prevent the construction of housing for 300 families who needed homes now. They debated. They argued. They compromised. They voted. The building was approved with modifications to protect the tree, including a redesigned southern facade that would allow sunlight to reach its branches. The entire matter was resolved in a single session lasting 2 hours and 14 minutes. I sat in that gallery and thought about the Varath crisis. 60 years of council deliberation about the fate of 14 billion people. And here, in a room smaller than my quarters on the council station, 9 humans had resolved a dispute about a tree and a building in an evening. It was not that humans were smarter. They were not. I had encountered many species with far greater raw intellectual capacity. It was not that they were more organized. Their society was, by galactic standards, a chaotic, contradictory, overlapping jumble of competing jurisdictions and rival interests and clashing opinions. But they decided. Right or wrong, ready or not, they made a choice and moved forward. They argued furiously. They disagreed at full volume. They criticized each other without hesitation, and then they voted and built, and if they got it wrong, they argued about that too, and fixed it and tried again. They did not wait for perfect consensus. They did not form committees to study whether forming a committee was warranted. They did not table decisions for further review until everyone who cared about the outcome had grown old and died. It was messy. It was imperfect. It was, by the elegant standards of the Galactic Council, almost embarrassingly unrefined. And it worked. It worked so well that a species barely a century into interstellar travel had managed to reshape the political landscape of a galaxy filled with civilizations millions of years older than they were. Before I left Earth, I spent an afternoon at an institution called a university, where young humans were trained in various academic disciplines. Owen introduced me to a professor of history, a woman named Grace Patterson with silver-streaked hair and sharp eyes that reminded me of Commander Beckett's, who specialized in something called organizational theory. I asked her the question that had been consuming me since my first meeting with Commander Beckett. How does your species make decisions so quickly? Every other civilization I have encountered takes years, sometimes decades, to reach conclusions that humans reach in days. What drives that speed? Professor Patterson thought about it for a moment, looking out the window at the campus below, where students walked between buildings with the quick, purposeful strides that I was beginning to recognize as characteristically human. Then she said something simple that rearranged my understanding of this species and, by extension, the galaxy itself. We are afraid, she said. I did not understand. Afraid of what? Of running out of time, she said. Our lifespans are short, counselor. 80, 90 years, if we are fortunate. We evolved on a world where the weather could change from calm to deadly without warning, where predators hunted us across plains where there was nowhere to hide, where diseases we could not see could destroy us in days. We learned very early, as a species, that hesitation was often more dangerous than making the wrong choice. A bad decision could be corrected. No decision usually meant you were already gone. She leaned forward, her eyes bright with the intensity that I had come to recognize as the human expression of deeply held conviction. Most species in your council live for centuries, or millennia. You have the luxury of patience. You can afford to deliberate for decades, for generations, because you will still be alive when the deliberation concludes. For us, every year spent talking about a problem is a year we might not get back. A year that someone affected by that problem has to survive without help. So we would rather build the bridge while we are still arguing about exactly where it should go than spend a lifetime drawing the perfect blueprint for a bridge that never gets built. I carried those words with me when I left Earth the following morning. I carried them through the quiet of faster-than-light travel, through the cold corridors of the council station, through every meeting and briefing and coordination session that filled my days in the action hall. We are afraid of running out of time. A species that knew it would not live forever had learned to treat every moment as a resource too precious to waste on empty words. And that fear, that urgent, driving awareness that life was short and problems were real and people were waiting, had made them the most effective force for change the galaxy had ever seen. 6 months after my visit to Earth, I returned to the Vareth system. an operation that dwarfed anything the Council had attempted in its history. Where there had been 32 completed stations, there were now over 240. A vast interconnected network of cities in space, linked by transport corridors and communication relays, orbiting the dying red star in a constellation of light and life that stretched across the inner system. 13 billion of the 14 billion Veroth citizens had been successfully relocated. The remaining billion were in transit, moving in steady streams from the planetary surfaces to the orbital stations, each family carrying whatever they could hold of their old lives into their new ones. But the habitats no longer bore only the human flag. I counted the symbols and emblems of 47 different species on the structures as our ship approached. Pelori medical bays occupied dedicated wings in each station, staffed by physicians from 12 different species working together. Oravari libraries had been established in the cultural districts to preserve Vareth literature, music, mathematical proofs, and philosophical texts that might otherwise have been lost when the planets became uninhabitable. Even the Talani had contributed, grudgingly at first, and then with growing enthusiasm, providing military-grade shield generators from their strategic reserves to protect the stations from stellar radiation. The humans had not just saved the Varath people, they had shown the galaxy how to save them together. He had transferred to the Verath project full-time several months earlier, trading the noise and chaos of Earth for the different, but equally intense noise and chaos of the largest construction and evacuation project the galaxy had ever undertaken. "Counselor Driss," he said, grinning broadly. "Good to see you again. And you, Owen. This is truly remarkable." "It is not bad for 14 months of work," he said, and then added with the characteristic human gift for understatement. We walked through the station together. I watched Verath families settling into their new homes, arranging their belongings on shelves, hanging artwork on walls that had been bare metal just weeks before. I watched children of 6 different species running through a park that had been cultivated in the station's central atrium, a green space with real trees and flowing water, and a domed ceiling painted to replicate the sky of the Verath homeworld, as it had looked in its golden age, before the star began its long expansion. The colors were warm and soft, and the Verath residents who walked beneath it often paused to look up at it with expressions that needed no translation. A Verath girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old by their species reckoning, was sitting on the grass in the park, trying to teach a Rithine hatchling how to play a game that involved tossing a small weighted ball back and forth. The hatchling had too many limbs to throw properly, its coordinated appendages getting tangled every time it tried to mimic the Verath girl's simple overhand motion. The girl laughed, not unkindly, and patiently repositioned the hatchling's primary arms, showing it a different technique. On the third attempt, the hatchling managed a wobbly toss. The ball sailed in a crooked arc and landed 2 meters from where the girl was standing. They both celebrated, as though it had been the greatest athletic achievement in galactic history. I found myself standing still, watching them, for longer than I intended. Eventually, I made my way to the observation deck on the station's upper level. It was a broad, open space with a transparent wall that looked out into the Verath system. The star was enormous in the viewport, a swollen red giant bleeding light and radiation across the void. It was still dying. That could not be changed. Some problems do not have solutions. Some endings cannot be prevented, no matter how quickly you act or how many resources you bring to bear. They had homes with walls and doors and windows that looked out on artificial skies painted in the colors of their lost world. They had schools where their children learned the mathematics and music that their civilization was renowned for. They had hospitals and parks and libraries and common rooms where elders played board games and children threw balls that sailed in crooked arcs, and everyone, for the first time in 60 years, could look forward instead of waiting. They had a second chance, built by hands from 100 different worlds, led by a species that had looked at a galaxy full of ancient civilizations, talking about a problem, and had simply started fixing it. She was small and silver-skinned, with wide dark eyes that reflected the bloated red star. She pressed her tiny hands against the transparent wall and stared out at the dying sun with the unself-conscious, fearless curiosity of the very young. "Are you a counselor?" she asked me, not looking away from the star. "I am," I said. "We do talk a lot, perhaps more than we should." She looked out at the red star for a while longer, her breath making small clouds of fog on the viewport. Then she looked up at me, with those wide, dark eyes. "Why did the humans help us?" It was such a simple question, a child's question, the kind of question that an adult might spend years constructing a complicated answer for, filling it with political context and strategic analysis, and historical precedent, and footnotes, and caveats, and qualifications. An entire committee could be formed to study the question. A position paper could be written. The paper could be reviewed and revised and submitted for further consideration. And standing there, looking out at the dying star and the constellation of rescue stations that surrounded it, at the lights of 240 habitats glowing against the dark, each one filled with families and laughter and the ordinary precious business of living, I finally understood what the answer was. It was the same answer Peter Hale had given me in a park under artificial trees. The same answer Captain Helen Cole had offered in her Spartan office full of construction schedules. The same answer that Commander Nora Beckett had delivered without a single wasted word to 4,000 delegates in the Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council. Because, I said, they understood that some things do not need a discussion. I thought about the council, about the 313 years I had spent inside its walls, about the elegance and the grandeur, and the towering historical achievement of bringing 4,000 species together under one roof to govern a galaxy. I thought about the debates I had won, and the treaties I had brokered, and the compromises I had crafted with such meticulous care over so many centuries. And I thought about the things I had not done, the crises I had acknowledged and filed away for further discussion, the suffering I had responded to with sympathetic words and no action, the lives that had ended, quietly, out of sight, in dying star systems and pirate corridors and refugee camps, while I sat in comfortable chambers, surrounded by comfortable colleagues, and perfected the art of sounding like I cared without ever doing anything about it. The humans taught the galaxy many things during that remarkable first year. They taught us how to build orbital habitats in months instead of decades. They taught us that armed escorts were more effective than diplomatic complaints at stopping piracy. They taught us that terraforming drones planted in dead soil could bring a world back to life faster than any environmental review committee could write a report about why it could not be done. But the most important thing they taught us had nothing to do with engineering, or logistics, or construction techniques. It was not a technology. It was not a strategy. It was not a system, or a process, or a methodology. It was an idea, the simplest, oldest, most obvious idea in the universe. So simple that 4,000 ancient civilizations, with millions of years of collective wisdom, had somehow managed to forget it entirely. That the purpose of civilization is not to discuss problems, it is to solve them. That words have value only when they lead to hands building, feet moving, ships flying toward the places where help is needed. That a committee report filed in triplicate and reviewed by 17 subcommittees and approved by a full chamber vote is worth less than a single shelter built with bare hands for a family that has nowhere else to go. And that silence, sometimes, says more than 1,000 speeches ever could. I watched a human cargo ship undock from Hope Harbor and accelerate away into the darkness, heading toward another mission, another system, another group of beings who needed help more than they needed a hearing. The ship was small against the immensity of space, a tiny point of warm light moving with quiet, determined purpose against the infinite black void. But small things, I had learned, could change everything. A single seed planted in dead soil, a single convoy escorted through dangerous space, a single shelter built for a family with nowhere else to go. A single species that refused to speak in a chamber full of talkers, not because they had nothing to say, but because they had decided that doing was more important than saying. I turned from the viewport, straightened the collar of my new uniform, the one that bore the insignia of the Cooperative Action Coalition instead of the traditional diplomatic corps, and walked toward the communication center. I had work to do. 3 crises were pending in the action hall. The 90-day window on one of them was closing, and a response team needed to be assembled. There were ships to coordinate, supplies to allocate, people to help. I was done discussing. It was time to act.